Hello, I'm Francis Seeley from Enfield Climate Action Forum, and I'd like to welcome you to our first workshop that we're doing on carbon literacy, and we're doing it jointly with the local United Nations Association. It's being presented by Ali Hessami, who is an expert on risk assessment and knows a great deal about climate change and carbon literacy. We'll be doing a second workshop on this and then some more work following this. But let's start with this by going over to Ali now.
Let me first of all share my screen and then say I'm really pleased and honored to share some thoughts on climate matters with EnCAF. Together with Francis, we both chair the local UNA association, and indeed some of my colleagues are present, as well as people from the regional UNA association, so-called London and South Eastern. Greetings to all. The intent here was an experiment, a social experiment, and the idea was try and increase insight and understanding of the climate matters in the local community. And then if it works, we can take it one step further and start delving into some practical aspects that the insights give us. And there are two facets to this insight. One is, let's understand the mechanics of climate change and global warming. So much of today's talk is about that. And the second part, and then we get introduced to a simulator that is actually capable of painting future pathways for us. And in the next session, we would then delve deeper into the use of that simulator. Of course, towards the end of this lecture, we'll end up with a simulator, but I didn't really wish to just present to you what is ultimately a mathematical wonder and say, isn't this good? Look what kind of graphs it generates, etc. So my intent tonight is to paint a picture about climate change. Much of the material that I'm using come from diverse sources, from Met Office all the way to MIT. So I'm grateful to all these sources who have allowed me to put together this talk for you. I came across En-ROADS, which you'll hear about a lot in these two talks, and maybe even more if we felt this social experiment is actually bringing local value to the local community in Enfield. You may see the name of another institution called IEEE, and they are an institution of technology and electrical and electronic engineers that I've been member of. And the reason I'm mentioning them is because they are likely to also help us as a partner should we wish to engage in further work in this direction. So without further ado, we want to talk about these two workshops that we are going to look at. In this first workshop, we are going to treat it as an introductory session to a climate concept and a climate model. Typically 1 hour of talk, possibly slightly shorter, and as much as we can allow, and that's Francis's choice, a question and answer period following this presentation material. The purpose is really to increase understanding of the mechanics of climate change and the reasons and a bit of science. I'll keep the language simple. I wouldn't resort to rims and rims of statistics and data. Everything would be hopefully graphical, and I'll go slow in order to enhance understanding. I'll be more than happy if you have any particular questions, burning questions in the middle to stop me. Otherwise, more than happy to finish, and then we go through a Q&A session. The second workshop was intended, or at least offered when I first raised this with Francis, to see if there is energy and desire to actually experiment. How can we use this tool, the so-called En-ROADS tool, to support some climate action locally? So bringing the global to local is a subject of second talk. And today we are largely focusing on a bit of context setting around why does Earth warm up? How does it warm up? And in a sense, what is the position of a tool such as a climate simulator in this context? Is it just for the geeks and scientists, or is there value in a community such as Enfield and dedicated people such as EnCAF to actually exploit this? And I am just seeing myself as a promoter because En-ROADS is made available globally to everyone. So I'll be a supporter and a promoter of En-ROADS. There is no funds involved in this. Everyone goes to En-ROADS on the basis of their own knowledge and passion and what to do about saving the future, frankly, from effects of climate warming. Starting with climate science, we might get the impression that this is, I don't know, last 10 years or last 20 years. Interestingly, many of the discoveries that we are banking our knowledge around climate science started in 18th century, around the time of American Civil War, so to speak. And there was a bit of discovery that the gases, there are different gases in the atmosphere, and all of them don't behave the same. Some seem to actually absorb radiation, heat from the sun's rays. And interestingly, they absorb it and then re-radiate it. So in a sense, they're almost acting as a telegraph basis, receive the energy, then send it downward. And we'll see later that they actually act almost like a greenhouse for the Earth, because when Earth tries to send some of this stuff back, the same gases tend to trap that temperature, the infrared energy or rays from the sun. So therefore, we end up with a kind of a glass of a roof of a greenhouse. Now, interestingly, the scientists found that the temperature of the Earth should be really lower than it is, because early 19th century, Fourier, who's a French mathematician, realized that the amount of energy received and radiated by Earth indicates that the surface temperature of the Earth should be much less than it is. So it is quite a strange phenomenon that the Earth is warmer than it should be from the rules of physics. The only thing they could speculate was there is something at work in the atmosphere that is giving rise to this temperature rise. An Irish scientist called John Tyndall actually did some experiments and realized that there is only a number of very rare gases in the atmosphere that, excuse me, that absorb this infrared thermal energy from sun. And interestingly, 98% of the air, which is made of oxygen and nitrogen, have no interaction. So sun just beams straight through, but a very small fraction of these gases, largely carbon dioxide, water vapor, and nitrous oxide, seem to actually do something with this energy. The mechanics of how these gases absorb and radiate wasn't discovered till 20th century. But initially, the scientists, as early as 18th century, were predicting that Earth is unusually warm for the mechanics and physical effects. Now, this has, at the time, had nothing to do with global warming. It was just trying to explain why is the average surface temperature of the globe higher than it should be. And gradually they discovered that there are three fundamental parameters at work here. And these are one of those miracles that almost like religious belief, that there are three factors about Earth that give rise to cycles of frost and ice ages and much warmer, hotter periods. And these three factors, one of them is referred to as orbital eccentricity, and that is the fact that the orbit of the Earth around the sun is not always elliptical. Sometimes it shrinks, so we get closer to the sun. Sometimes it turns into an ellipse, so we get further from the sun. The other thing is that the axis of Earth as a sphere rotating around on this orbit is not perpendicular. So it's not vertical with respect to the sun. It's got a tilt. It's called axial tilt. And the other side, the final point, is called axial precession. And that is that even this axis, which is tilted with respect to the plane of rotation, itself is rotating and changing. So in a sense, the way the Earth behaves mechanically, according to Newtonian gravitational laws, is likely to create temperature cycles. We are going to get heat periods and ice age periods, irrespective of the current problem that we are facing and the crisis that we are facing. We get to that as well. So the real learning point here is that this mechanics is built into the nature, that Earth won't have a constant temperature. Of course, it goes through winter and summer according to its orbital position, but it's going through a much longer cycles of temperature change. And interestingly, according to that, therefore, if we have these cycles and these cycles run into tens of thousands of years, so there would be 10,000 years where Earth would be gradually warming, and there would be another 10,000 years where it would be gradually cooling. And interestingly, looking at the records from Arctic average summer temperature, taking water and ice samples there, we should be in the cooling period at the moment. If you look at the graph here, which starts from around birth of Christ all the way to year 2000, we have a gradual decline, but you suddenly notice that we have a sharp rise towards the end. That's obviously the challenge we are all facing, and that's a crisis referred to as global warming. So basically, there is a 2,000-year trend that due to distancing of those three factors of Earth from the sun, which is referred to as Milankovitch orbital cycle, we should be on a cooling basis in the Arctic region and average temperature around the Earth. And obviously, we have suddenly noticed around 1900s upward that we have a major uptick in the temperature. And this is what's concerned everyone, because typically we should be on a reasonably average downward temperature going towards an ice age in time. So initial thought was this increase in temperature could be due to these gases, and it could be by human activity, because otherwise there is no other factor other than those three parameters in the orbital nature of Earth around the sun that explains increase in temperature as we are observing. So let's go into what is called the greenhouse effect. So why is warming actually, as I mentioned, why is Earth warmer than it should be according to rules of physics? And we have here a number of elements in the atmosphere which are responsible for it. There is water vapor that we know in abundance. There is also carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and a number of other gases which are referred to. These exist in the atmosphere in a very small fraction, about 1% of the composition of the total atmosphere, and they absorb the sun's infrared and radiate it downward, and when Earth wants to return it, they take some of the radiation back from the Earth and send it back again. So in a sense, they act like a roof over a greenhouse. They let the light and the heat in, but they don't leave all the heat out. So in a sense, we are getting a kind of a greenhouse built around the Earth by its own atmosphere. What are these greenhouse gases? The most excuse me, the most abundant one is water vapor, and it constitutes a fair proportion of the air, depending on the temperature. Then comes carbon dioxide, then comes methane, nitrous oxide, and what we call hydrofluorocarbons or HFCs, which are the type of gases we use in refrigeration and so on. But there is a fundamental difference between these gases, that some of them stay in the atmosphere and do this job effectively for thousands of years. Others, like water vapor, typically last only a couple of weeks, and they precipitate and turn into rain and leave the atmosphere. And of course, they evaporate again, but nevertheless, the effect of the most abundant greenhouse gas, which can reflect and absorb infrared energy, is almost nullified because it's not sustainable. It doesn't stay there long enough. So the effect is water vapor leaves the atmosphere. Therefore, the next gas or next green gas, which is CO2 greenhouse gas, is the one which persists, and it's typically got two cycles. It's got about 100-year cycle that it takes for carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to actually be absorbed into leaves and plants and trees and animals. Half of it actually stays there for thousands of years. So in a sense, carbon dioxide is a reasonably ever-present, permanent, and persistent gas in the atmosphere. So the conception was, all right, if we have this greenhouse gas and it's sticky and doesn't disappear, doesn't get blown by anything, and it stays there minimum of 100 years, if not half of it stays there for thousands of years, for reasons that we don't, I'm sorry, we don't want to get into because of the nature of the conversation here. We need to start thinking about, is this responsible for this warming effect? So why does it have such a strong influence on the temperature and the climate? So people, scientists started speculating that really the warming could only be due to CO2 and the other handful. And basically they said, if we didn't have these gases, Earth would be permanently sub-zero temperature. We won't have a place we could easily live. And that's almost like a miracle. We have a very small percentage of gases that basically trap the heat. And they also obviously speculated that, okay, if this is CO2, then can we understand how much CO2 has effect on, if we double the CO2 concentration, how much would it raise temperature? but they realized that the relationship is not direct. So doubling CO2 doesn't warm the Earth atmosphere or Earth's surface twice. There is what's called the logarithmic relationship, which is a mathematical relationship. The best way to understand it, if you actually increase the CO2 in the atmosphere by a factor of 8, you only get 3 times more temperature in terms of greenhouse effect. There are other forces at work here, volcanoes, something called El Nino or La Nina effects in the Pacific. But basically, what is concerning us is CO2, and the foundation of CO2, other than oxygen, is carbon. Those other greenhouse gases, for your information, are generally measured in their equivalence with CO2. So methane is a strong greenhouse gas with a power of multiplier effect of 28. Nitrous oxide is a multiplier of 273, and fluorinated gases, those gases we use for refrigeration or so-called laughing gas, etc., have a multiplier effect of 14,000. So in a sense, if their concentration was anywhere close to CO2, HFCs would have 14,000 times more impact on temperature rise than CO2 itself. We are lucky that these are not in huge proportions. Looking at historic temperatures, because thermometers weren't invented too long ago, about 3 centuries ago, people started taking measurements of temperature, but they navigating around the globe in ships. So they took buckets of water from the ocean, measured the temperature, land temperature, water temperature, etc. And even lately, we started taking infrared emissions from the oceans and from the Earth with satellites. And we realized that the temperature is on the rise. And there are 4 ways of measuring. There are 4 systems of temperature measurement. And even though they disagree a bit about earlier temperatures, because there were not that many thermometers around or scientific measurement systems, but when we get to modern times, 1900s onward, these 4 systems around the world all converge and tell the same story. So one story is that the Earth is warming. This is largely due to CO2, as we have speculated earlier, and it's not uniform. There are various areas under satellite observation by NASA satellites, and much of the warming is away, strangely, from major cities. The warming is taking place in places we don't expect, such as northern Canada, northern California. You might have remembered of the fires and the very high temperatures there, even in Siberia. And very small percentage of this warming is due to urbanization, in the sense of concentration of large number of people and cars and heating sources, etc. So where does this CO2 concentration that's giving rise to massive increase in Arctic temperature and average global temperature come from? This natural concentration of carbon dioxide gas, or CO2, is around, it's measured by parts per million in volume, and it's around 200, 280. We currently have 400 units. So really we have exceeded 25, 30% beyond natural limit and concentration level of CO2. And some worry that if we do not take urgent action, this may even reach 1,000 parts per million, roughly 5 times its natural level. So it's very worrying that there is a very high concentration. Unfortunately, all that means is that there is some bad news in this climate science, and we need to, CO2 comes from man-made emissions. As you have seen previous traces, they seem to commence around the time of Industrial Revolution, where we started burning fossil fuels in large quantities, and then got into industrialization, and then city dwelling and burning fossil fuels and gas and coal, etc. And the worry is, if we don't take urgent action, we are going to see a rise of 2.5 to 4.5 degrees by the end of the century. And that is going to keep continuing if we do not manage to contain this problem to much higher, to about 4.5 degrees. And these are unprecedented levels of heat in the environment of the Earth, and massive impact on virtually every facet of life. And there is a necessity, given this is a man-made problem, to make substantial sacrifice and change this emission through whatever mechanism, because as the science shows us, these kind of CO2 concentrations have not been seen for not only a couple of hundred years, for 50 million years. There is no track record of any samples taken around the Earth that shows such high levels of CO2 concentration. Here's an example that one of the scientists shared not so long ago on 11th of July. According to Elliot Jacobson, the 7 hottest days are in Earth's 100,000 year history, last 100,000 years, happened before 11. So early July, we had 7 days. The average temperature of the Earth's surface exceeded any temperature would have existed in the last 100,000 years. So there's something not quite right. We can't also ignore it. And there is an unprecedented impact virtually on everything, on biodiversity, on marine biodiversity and marine life, on availability of water and its security, on food ecosystem, even on cities, how we cope, our infrastructures being really capable of coping with extremities of heat, and ultimately human health and well-being. I was reading Greta's book on climate today, and there was even speculation, not the speculation, it was one of the chapters is on about conflict and temperature. And it was arguing scientifically that research shows if the temperature rises, we should be expecting more wars and confrontation and conflicts arising around the world. So it's not just worry about property and nature and water, etc. So the headlines say it all. The press are all worried about long heat waves, food security, energy security, and more heat waves to come, predicted by the Met Office. So what do we do about it? We have landed in this unpleasant, undesirable state. Nobody predicted that industrialization and industrial revolution is going to have such a heavy price to pay downstream by the future generations. And now we are feeling it and sensing it. So this global temperature rise is going to continue, and the CO2 concentration is also going to continue the way. So being on the rise. There are lots of ways that scientists try and understand so-called the pathways. What can we do? And obviously, because this is such a complex territory, they have to make a lot of assumptions. So you see different predictions based on the assumptions that this is the rate of economic growth, this is the rate of, we assume this is the population rise, this is the rate of discovery of new sources of energy, this is the rate of introducing renewables. So by having various forms of assumptions and combination of so-called scenarios, they have different predictions about temperature rise. Now, should we just ignore this? What kind of risks are we expecting? So what? According to deniers, it doesn't exist, but the data that you have seen is not something somebody has created. It's a huge consensus on international scientific community. They are all measuring that temperature, they're all measuring the data. So it's not something that's exclusive to one nation who can fabricate some fake information. One of the biggest challenges is rise in sea levels. If you look at the diagram here, so many thousand years ago, we actually had the sea levels 120 meters below today. So the sea levels that we see today have only been around for about 7,000 years. They have been much lower because lower temperature. Remember, the temperature of the Earth at the moment, according to Milankovitch, orbital cycle should be on the decline, and much of it would have been frozen and would have been low. So expected consequence is that 2-meter rise due to glacial meltdown by 2100, should we not be able to curtail this problem. Then we have matters of extreme heat and humidity. The events that were rare and once in 10 years are going to become almost a couple of months a year. So suddenly the proportion of expected number of high risk, high heat strokes, even in the US, which is the Northern Hemisphere, is going to be much higher than we have ever anticipated and experienced. Then comes massive storms. And this is just prediction of how much harm and damage will be done in the US, both in terms of sea level rise, claiming land and destroying existing infrastructure, to damage caused by extreme destructive storms that is part of turbulence in the atmosphere due to temperature rise. Then comes the other unfortunate consequence, acidification of the oceans. Very high concentrations of CO2 or carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is going to be dissolved in the oceans and turning, mixing with water, going to turn into carbonic acid, and that's going to have massive impact both on marine ecosystem and all the planktons and all the corals that basically nothing can form a shell because it gets dissolved in carbonic acid because there's too much acid in the ocean's water. And then crisis of droughts, massive floods, and interestingly, again, in the Greta's book, there are few chapters on potential political and social destabilization. So it's not just physical things that we would have drought and shortage of water and destructive storms, etc. The fabric of stable societies around the world is going to be destabilized. As I mentioned, there is also science to back that there is much more potential for global conflicts, even at the local level in peaceful settings, than we have experienced and we have got used to so far. So what happens is basically either denying, we can deny to our heart's desire, but we can't wait and see. So let's not do anything, see what happens. So the general idea is even if we manage to cut all our emissions, that means stop using all the energy sources that we know, oil and gas and coal, etc., with the exception of nuclear energy, this concentration lasts in the atmosphere. And depending on where we stop, it's going to linger on for a couple of thousand years. So the concentration is not going to disappear because we turn the gas off and all go pious and don't use any hydrocarbons. This is one problem. The other one is the temperature damage is going to be reasonably long-term because the oceans act like storage heaters, and this temperature doesn't vanish over a short period of time. Heat gets trapped and stored in the massive amount of water around the global oceans, and we won't see a massive temperature drop because of that capacity, almost like a temperature storage. So how much renewables do we need to limit the temperature rise to below or around 2 degrees? We need to make massive decisions today. Roughly, if we actually have 80% of our energy sources being renewable, we stand a chance to stop the temperature rise around the globe to around 2 degrees. According to the latest forecast, the target of Paris Agreement, which was 1.5 degrees, is going to be met in almost 4 years from now. So by around 2027, 2028, average global temperature going to rise 1.5 degrees above its average in pre-industrial age. That was supposed to be our target and doom and gloom, but that's already on target to be reached. Now we are looking at the next level. Can we keep it between 1.5 and 2 by 2050? The other way that scientists are looking at is, apart from reducing emissions of greenhouse gases, which means massive changes in our energy consumption, we should also be able to either compensate, start doing, developing what we call a science of climate engineering, or start adapting our environment, our homes, our ways of life to climate change. So it's too late to do anything about it. Now it's adaptation time rather than prevention time. And the scientists basically say, we have got a certain budget of CO2 we can pour into the atmosphere, currently estimated around 600 gigatons, before we lose control of the temperature. It depends when we start actually containing this 600 gigatons. Just to give you a feel about it, annually, currently, we generate as a global community about 40 gigatons of CO2 per year. So 600 gigatons is the absolute limit before the temperature gets out of control and goes beyond 2 degrees. There are, of course, solutions. Reduction of emissions is one solution. Coming with climate engineering, which we'll see, is another solution. Adaptation is the other final approach. And maybe these are not used in isolation. Maybe we need to just package everything, reduce emissions, start doing a bit of climate engineering, start adapting our bridges, roads, cars, houses, factories, offices for much higher temperatures that we are. One solution, for example, for climate engineering is capturing CO2. And here's a process that shows if you want to capture CO2 from free air, you basically stick the flue of a CO2 emission production line, a factory, a power station, etc., into a cooling tower, and then mix it with some absorber agents and then take those absorber agents and cool it further until it liquefies and CO2 is segregated from that absorbent, feed back the absorbent back, and use the liquid CO2 to pump it into cavities in earth, or pump it or use it elsewhere. So here's one typical solution, but none of these solutions are that cheap and immediate effect, basically. So adapting can give us multiple options. So we are at the critical stage to make those decisions. What are this bundle of scenarios and decisions that give us high resilience and low risk of facing a calamity as far as rise in temperature and massive disturbance to atmospheric conditions and climate is concerned? Some of these decisions take us through what we call low resilience and high risk. Some of these decisions take us to high resilience and low risk. And each one of these is so-called a pathway to resilience. And each one of them has got enormous cost. If we go towards mitigating, like reducing emissions, the emitters, typically the industrial nations pick up the bill. If you go for adaptation, everyone around the globe needs to chip in and help achieve these things. But obviously, some nations are not capable of spending money both on the social problems and health and education, etc., as well as massive sums on climate adaptation. So this is where the role of a simulator comes in. A simulator is basically a powerful way of understanding what are these scenarios and combination of decisions, and what kind of effect would we get. So what kind of bang for the bucks we will get if we, for example, put all our energies into research for thorium-based nuclear fission or nuclear fusion solution. What about us going for afforestation or reforestation? What would we get? How much land do we need? And if we actually put all our energies into growing trees on a massive scale, say pick a piece of land the size of India and just grow woodland on that, what would we get? So these problems are too complex and too interrelated to be able to sit down and calculate with a big computer or by a brilliant scientist. This is where these simulators come in, because these are built on mathematical representation of the dynamics of our atmospheric conditions and our climate. So all the influencing factors, from sun's radiation to man-made emissions, etc., are poured into some equations and some mathematics. And one of the most popular climate simulators is En-ROADS, and En-ROADS stands for Energy Rapid Overview and Decision Support. And as the name implies, it's largely focused on what can we do about energy in terms of reduction of hydrocarbons and reduction of consumption of gas and oil and coal, etc. And it helps us see the outcome. Without those, we basically, I remember years ago where I acted as a risk manager for British Rail. Every time there was a train accident, suddenly safety became popular, hit the agenda, the press and even politicians would come and shed some tears about the losses on the train. And suddenly they would start putting a package of money on extra training for safety. Drivers get trained, everyone who works on maintenance get trained. 6 months later, the temperature drops and no one's worried about the accident. So we don't know what we got from all that investment, instantaneous investment in driver safety, etc. And this is the kind of challenge we are facing. We are facing a very complex ecosystem that we poorly understand. And we need to be smart about it, least of all because we are right on the edge of the precipice, as we have seen. This model has been created by a number of climate scientists and a university in the US, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, one of the most renowned scientific institutions in the world. And it's been recently updated as well. They have added some improvements because as our knowledge increases in terms of what's the effect of economic growth, what's the effect of temperature, population rise, etc., these equations, parameters get tuned and we get, if you like, more clear predictions. So technically, this tool is there to support our decisions. As I alluded to, it's called system dynamics model. It's a complex mathematical system of equations with feedback. So this has impact on this, but when that goes up, has impact on what caused it in the first place. So these are not the kind of things our brain can work out very easily. There is a scientific regime, and this is the shape of this model. So what I like to do now that we got this far, by hopefully understanding a bit about what is it that gives rise to temperature cycles, irrespective of our existence on Earth. And then came Industrial Revolution and massive emission of CO2 into the atmosphere that we couldn't care less about because it was leading to prosperity and wealth and comfort and everything until now, where us as the next generation post-industrial revolution beginning to pick up the tab for the cost of what our ancestors hopefully enjoyed in terms of prosperity and comfort and life, and need to do something about it. So what I like to do is to pause a bit and switch to the actual simulator, because the simulator is the best thing to, I just want to introduce it. I don't want to, I know I'm mindful of the time that we have reached, almost as much as human patience for somebody constantly talking. Hopefully this wasn't that boring or that confusing, because I try to keep the language simple and the, if you like, the chronology fairly straightforward, that Earth goes through these cycles itself. We have just come and made it, reversed it indeed. Whilst it was supposedly cooling in this Milankovitch cycle, we have pumped a lot of energy, which is sitting there like a greenhouse and is unusually raising the temperature with massive consequences on our welfare, on life, on even, as I alluded to, even on conflict around the globe. So I'll pause a bit, switch to the actual simulator. The intent is just to show it. Well, you can see the picture, frankly. Maybe I don't even need to do that. I'll do that in the next session, where if I can just quickly explain to you how this simulator works. That's all that we need to do tonight. And next session, I will take you through the fundamental influencing factors that are giving rise to temperature increase on the average temperature of the globe. And then the intent is, as a social experiment, to look at these parameters and say, what amongst all these causes of temperature rise is possible to do as an individual, as a local community, as a county, Enfield County, for example. Now, the simulator broadly predicts the temperature rise between the year 2000 to 2100. And it's got a condition called baseline, which means all these mathematical equations, taking on board the best scientific data from satellites, from research, from the various sources, actually pour all of these data in terms of where is our energy, how much of it is coal, how much of it is oil, how much of it is nuclear, what's the chances of finding new sources of energy? How fast are we going to replace old-fashioned carbohydrates with renewables? So all of these are parameters in this simulation model. Then it looks at transportation. You say, of course, transportation is contributing to emissions, to CO2 emissions, to exhaust fumes and air pollution, etc. So looks at the share of transportation in temperature rise. Then it looks at the share of buildings, the heating we use, the amount of energy we use in our heating systems and industrial electrification, and say how much of these parameters are contributing to temperature rise, so that if we manage to somewhat go more efficient or increase electrification at the expense of reducing burning coal and oil, what would we get? Then it also interestingly looks at growth both from population rise as well as economic growth, because population rise by very nature, the more the people on Earth, the more energy they need, and that energy currently largely comes from hydrocarbons, and that means more emissions. The other corollary to that is economic growth. The more prosperous we are, the more we splash around, and we demand more energy. So the energy consumption is really proportionate to prosperity of mankind and degree of economic growth. There are two other factors that are used in this complex En-ROADS simulator. One is the contribution to temperature rise from farming, food, and industrial emissions. What are the effects of deforestation, where we see from the news the Brazilian wood forests get chopped down for cattle raising and prospecting for gold and metals, etc. What are the effects? What would happen if we manage to influence that, reduce that as a global community, since we are all in the same boat together? Then it looks at methane and gas emissions from industry and food production, such as keeping cattle, raising cattle, etc. And the final parameter that's used in the model is there any possibility of large-scale removal of carbon from the atmosphere? So one way is to reduce emission, the other one is to suck the carbon or CO2 out of the atmosphere, and as a result, reduce that greenhouse effect that currently is on the rise. So there are 6 classes of influence factors that collectively contribute to temperature rise. And as you can see currently, based on all the realities of today, that's called the baseline, based on how much we use, how much electricity we generate from renewables, how much oil we use, how much natural gas we consume as a global community, not per country. All of these put together, prediction is end of the century, we'll have 3.3 degrees centigrade temperature rise if we do nothing. So this is inclusive of all the government policies, all the global commitments, etc., as of today. So the parameters are then available to us to play with and say, okay, what would happen if I reduce coal consumption and burning in power stations to 0 from 5 years from now? How much would that contribute to temperature drop, etc.? So the simulator allows you to see combination of these scenarios and calculates the impact on temperature rise. I would leave that as a topic for the next session for those who are brave enough to continue on this journey, and commend you for your tolerance and forbearance to bring you this far. More than happy to engage in some conversation and Q&A as the need arises. Over to you, Francis.
Okay, thanks very much. That was really, really detailed and explained in a way that, wasn't too technical. can I just show people just for a minute what the real model looks like if we had it up? If we did it, this is the actual model itself that Ali was talking about. And what he's going to show us next week is how it affects policy. So that if you were to change afforestation from a low level to a very high level, you can see how it impacts on temperature at the end. And if you were to have more energy efficiency, for example, that reduces it. And he's going to show us next week how these work. And it can be done over time. For example, if you have a carbon price, you can see that makes a difference very differently. So it has an effect on the reduction of carbon emissions that affect temperature, but it also shows you how quickly it does it. Now, I'm not going to go into it anymore because I don't know it anywhere near as well as Ali does, but I'm just showing you basically how it works and how you shift the model around. Okay, so next time we will be going into talking about the model itself and how we can adjust it and how it may help local policy.